Welcome to the program. Well, the two major parties have been trying to outmuscle each other this week on who can be tougher in reducing the size of government. But has either side really shown much track record when it comes to spending restraint? This week also saw the Prime Minister outline a new, speedier timeframe for withdrawing Australian troops from Afghanistan. But what will be left behind in that country, and has this war been worthwhile? Joining us this week, the Chief Government Whip and former Defence Minister Joel Fitzgibbon, Cassandra Wilkinson, columnist and author, and also hoping to be Labor's candidate for Sydney Lord Mayor. Gerard Henderson is the Director of the Sydney Institute and the Sydney Morning Herald columnist, and Kevin Andrews, the Shadow Minister for Families, Housing and Human Services. Welcome to you all. Let's start with the budget and the debate that's been raging. Kevin Andrews, do you agree with Joe Hockey that we should have a smaller government and in particular a smaller welfare state?
We should always be vigilant about the size of government. Joe was speaking in London in the context of what's happened in Europe, and the reality is that Europe is a key lesson. Take Greece, for example. If you make tax virtually optional and you make payments, entitlements, more or less open-ended, then you're going to get a squeeze at some stage, and we see that in Europe.
But he was also drawing it back to Australia and saying we need to look more at our Asian neighbours and drawing a parallel with the sort of spending that goes on in this region, which is a lot less than our welfare spend.
Well, what he was doing was contrasting a European approach, which is the socialist welfare state, which we've seen since the Second World War, and the Asian approach. Now, can I say at the outset, we're not planning a major review of welfare spending. In fact, I was the last minister who was engaged in major welfare reform, and that cost us $4.2 billion at the time. So major welfare reform actually costs money. You hope that over time you'll get greater participation and greater productivity, but the initial welfare reform is an investment, so we're not planning that.
And you said no review either of
No, we're not having
spend.
a review of welfare, and I think that some of Joe's remarks have obviously been taken out of context, but that happens from time to time. But the general point that we should be vigilant about what government spends and what programs we're putting in place. You know, if I was making a political point, which I'm not trying to do overly, but, you know, if people get things like set-top boxes when they can buy them at the local electrical retailer, then that does start to create an attitude of entitlement, and I think that's what we've got to be vigilant about.
But just on this, I mean, when you say this attitude of entitlement, how does that, and the need to show spending restraint and rein in the welfare state, how does that fit with the Coalition's position in the last few years, where you've opposed government attempts to means test handouts like the family tax benefit, the baby bonus, the private health insurance rebate? You've said no to all of those things. Well,
that's my point. If anybody's saying we're just embarking on a slash and burn exercise, we're not. If you take one of those, such as private health insurance, in which there is a debate in society, but our view about that is that if you shift people from private health insurance, and that means a diminution in the numbers there, they're going to go into the public hospitals and the public system, and ultimately that's going to cost you more.
So there is a case for some form of government welfare in some of these areas, going to people right up the income scale.
There's a case for looking at each of these measures individually and saying what would be the consequence of a change. And to take that example of the private health insurance rebate, if you push people out of private health insurance, they're going to be in the public hospital system, and that's going to cost us. So one way or the other, there's going to be a price.
Let's bring everyone else in on this. Well, Cass, to you on this. It seems to me it was a brave thing, but an important thing for someone like Joe Hockey to say, we've got to reduce the size of government.
It was, and the best thing that anyone could have said about it was here, coming from both sides. I mean, the example of Asia is as silly as the example of Europe. Australia should be its own best example in this regard. We have been a proud, prosperous, free people who have not been traditionally highly government dependent. But what we've seen in the last couple of decades is that both Labor and Liberal have now engineered a rusted-on welfare dependency. Each of our constituencies are different, but the times when I have backed Julia Gillard is when she's taken brave decisions like trying to get people off welfare dependency, reforms of disability dependency, for instance. Whereas you know, to see both parties now ruling out any serious review of government expenditure seems mad to me.
Joel Fitzgibbon, the instant Labor reaction to this today was, well, tell us exactly where you're going to cut, what are you going to cut, what should go. But isn't there room for a debate about this?
Well, like Kevin, I tried to be not unduly political.
Don't try too hard,
but, you know, we're living in an increasingly global economy. We're exposed to that global environment. We have to be competitive. Our agenda, of course, is one of productivity. Joe has made it quite clear his agenda is what I would describe as a race to the bottom. But yeah, of course, the structure of government is an ongoing project, and we all need to strive to ensure the government is as lean as can be and efficient. But we've also got to make sure that we live by our standards, not the standards of some of our Asian neighbours.
Gerard, what about the politics of this? Well, it might be worthy to talk about the size of government. It does create some uncomfortable questions for the coalition, given their recent track record.
Well, Joe Hockey was speaking at the Institute of Economic Affairs in London. He was focused predominantly on Europe and the Northern Hemisphere. The references he made to Australia were quite moderate. These days, people say politicians are bland and boring, and then when someone makes a speech that's interesting, people say, well, you shouldn't have said it, what a terrible thing to say, and then the media or many sections of the media get terribly upset and want to ask many more questions about it all. I thought it was a useful contribution to the debate. As to the politics of it, they'll be around for a week or so. I then suspect they'll fade away. I don't think the coalition's going to cut heavily into payments, but there is a good reason to look at it. And
was this also a message internally in the coalition, do you think, as well? I mean, we've seen particularly some of the newer, younger Liberals bristle a bit at the propensity to spend from Tony Abbott. Was this Joe Hockey sending them a signal that he's going to be more of an economic dry?
Well, when you speak to Tony Abbott, he's conscious about expenditure and the need for restraint. As a senior minister in the Howard government, he wasn't notably a big spender. He was a considered minister, quite an efficient minister. I think it's easy to beat up on this. I think some of the criticisms of the Howard and Costello government are unfair, and you've got to bear in mind they did deliver surpluses. So the question is whether they should have been making any payments in terms of the way they made them or in terms of tax cuts. Tax cuts might have been better, but they were hardly a government that was unconcerned about the budget at bottom line. If that had been the case, they wouldn't have been delivering surpluses.
Let's look at the government's pre-budget positioning. The Prime Minister's made a very strong claim in the few weeks left before the budget that returning to surplus is important because it's going to put downward pressure on interest rates. Now, if that's the case, Joel Fitzgibbon, what have the last few years of record deficits done?
Well, the last few years of record deficits, David, has been about keeping Australia out of recession in the face of a terrible global environment, and we've been very successful. And we always had a plan to ensure that we return the budget to surplus, and we will. And she's made the very valid point that running a contractionary fiscal policy gives room to the Reserve Bank to start easing interest rates, and of course all the consequences, positive consequences that has for the Australian economy.
But couldn't you argue that instead of running up those massive deficits, particularly with that second stimulus package, you could have left it to the Reserve Bank to do more of the cutting of interest rates to stimulate the economy?
No, I don't think so, because of the nature of the global forces we were facing. There's no doubt that fiscal stimulus, money, cash into the community and into industry was necessary. We're back to now.
But wouldn't a cut in interest rates have done that? Wouldn't have some deeper cuts in interest rates have done that?
No, because it wouldn't have had the immediate effect the cash injections into people's pockets had and the injection into public infrastructure had.
Kevin Andrews?
I think there's two things to say about this. That if by definition the Prime Minister is saying now that a return to surplus will ease the pressure on interest rates, then by definition running high budget deficits has put pressure on interest rates for the last 3 years. I mean, we've had about $167 billion worth of deficit over 3 years, 57 billion, 48 billion and 37 billion. And indeed this year it started with a projection of 12, it's gone out to 37, and we won't know for some months what it's actually going to be. So over that period of time we've had these huge deficits, which, if the Prime Minister is now to be believed, has had a pressure on interest rates. But the second thing is, in terms of talking about a surplus, we were promised a surplus in year one. We got $57 billion deficit. Promised a surplus into year two, we get a $48 billion deficit. We're now finding we've been promised a surplus, $37, maybe $40 billion deficit, and we won't know, because we're talking about the 2012-13 budget. We won't know, not at this year's budget, we won't know at next year's budget. We'll find out at the MyEFO statement in October, November, December of 2013, and of course we'll have an election by then.
There's a lot of debate about whether we should be trying to get back into surplus so quickly, and it is a big turnaround from around $40 billion deficit this year to a surplus forecast next financial year. Gerard, do you think it's a good idea?
I think it's a good idea. I think it is a big turnaround. I think we probably did spend too much in previous years. If you look at the recession, it was essentially a recession of the Northern Hemisphere. Apart from New Zealand, nations in our region with which we trade didn't experience a recession. In fact, experienced strong growth. But as Joel was making the point, I mean, it seems we're now back to about trend growth. And if you're back to about trend growth, then you should be looking to getting back into surplus. I think the government's position is the correct position, but it's probably going to be pretty tough to get.
And do you reckon it will have any impact on interest rates?
Oh, well, it would be one factor among others. But look, the fact that interest rates are where they are does give the Reserve Bank some leverage, which other nations don't have. I mean, people may say that our rates are higher than many other countries, but better to have the official rate at our level than the official rate at the United States level, where you can't reduce rates because they don't really exist in the first place.
Yeah,
so
there's no room to stimulate.
I mean, I think the record of the Reserve Bank over a period of time is pretty good, but I'm not an expert on this area, but I think the general principle of getting back into surplus makes sense.
Cass, what do you think? Because the Greens have run a pretty strong line that we shouldn't be rushing back to surplus now. We should instead be doing things like boosting the New Start allowance, rolling out a Denticare scheme, these sort of things.
But the Greens have never really understood economic policy. What they confect an interest in economics in order to justify greater public spending, and they seize upon a sort of Keynesian-esque explanation that spending is somehow counter-cyclically necessary, but in fact all they're asking for is additional subsidies and additional handouts.
And higher taxes on mining.
And higher taxes, exactly. And in many ways the discussion about surplus or deficit is lazy public policy. The harder debate to have is which programs should you fund, what works, what doesn't, and what are your opportunity costs in terms of your total budget outlays. That's where you have to look at what problems are worth solving, how much should government do, can government act effectively. And the Greens get themselves out of having to have those discussions by pretending that the problem is an unwillingness to have a deficit budget.
What about the PM's comments in favour of a cut in interest rates? I mean, normally this is an area that Prime Ministers, Treasurers, senior government figures refuse to comment on, say it's up to the independent Reserve Bank. The Prime Minister in her speech in Perth was very clear in saying a rate cut would be good for families and businesses.
One of the few things that both major parties did right was to support the independence of the Reserve Bank, and I think that the serious economists in this country and other countries agree that the independent advice and action of our Reserve Bank was one of the things that's got us through not just the GFC, but the tech wreck and the Asian crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is about to influence the Reserve Bank.
It's clearly just politicking.
It's politicking, isn't it? And
look, in view of the problems that the Prime Minister has politically, it's not such
it's not a terrible
intervention.
Crime,
no, it's not.
But is it going to mean that in future she's going to be asked and will have to supposedly offer a view on what the Reserve Bank should do?
Oh, she may. But look, the Reserve Bank's record is such as I don't think anyone who knows them, knows the bank, believes that they will be influenced by the government. They put up interest rates shortly before the 2007 election.
Yeah.
Peter Costello and John Howard weren't particularly happy about it, so I don't think it's going to have much of an effect, and I can understand why Julia Gillard's saying what she's saying, so I think it'll all wash up in the debate.
But David, can I just say, she didn't say that the Reserve should reduce rates. She just made the point, backed by...
It would be nice.
No one
she said it would be good for families and businesses.
No one less than Max Corden, the preeminent specialist in this area in this country. She simply made the point that a contractionary fiscal policy will give the reserve a greater opportunity.
But she also said it would be good for families and businesses if rates were cut. That's not expressing a view?
The natural consequence, of course, is that it would be good for families. But can I just pick
it's
up
hardly being
Kevin's
neutral,
point?
though, is it?
Kevin made the point that if the Prime Minister says now that a budget surplus keeps interest rates low, then it must flow logically that the big budget deficit we had must have been putting upward pressure on interest rates. Not true, because we didn't face the high terms of trade we now face pre and during the GFC. And it's that high terms of trade which has changed that dynamic.
I want to just ask you, Joel Fitzgibbon, as a former Defence Minister, about one area of budget spending that is apparently again under the microscope and in line for further cuts. Defence. We saw a cut in the defence budget in last year's budget. Is there room for another cut this year? Can Defence afford another haircut?
Well, David, there's nothing more important a role for a government than the defence of the nation. And in the lead up to the 2009 White Paper, we spent many, many months assessing our strategic environment, not just me, not just the chiefs, but we had independent advice as well. And we came to the conclusion that given the nature of the region, we needed what we called Force 2030, and you've got to have a certain amount of money to fund that capability and a defence force of that size. Now, the strategic assessment hasn't been revisited. Nothing has changed. It's a bit like house insurance. You cannot take it if you like, but there are consequences. And, you know, I know it's heresy for some people, but I think defence should be bipartisan. It should be quarantined. If the strategic assessment says we need X, Y and Z, we should fund X, Y and Z.
And what did you think then about last year's defence cuts?
Well, some might call it cuts, some might call it reprogramming. I only hold the view that Force 2030, that is the outcome of the 2009 White Paper, should be adequately funded.
And then the way it's going, do you think you can now meet the 2009 White Paper targets?
I'm concerned that unless there's a new and reinvigorated focus, that we are at risk of slipping.
There was a pretty disturbing report out today from the Strategic Policy Institute about one particular aspect of that Force 2030 plan, submarine capability. At the moment, it looks like we're not on track to meet that 2009 White Paper commitment that you talk about. We're going to be left in about 15 years potentially with a gap in our submarine capability. No subs.
Well, again, 12 submarines was the response to the strategic assessment. It was always going to be difficult. I heard Andrew Davies, the author of that report today, say that we may have made it if we'd begun the process before the ink had dried on the White Paper. It seems we've lost 3 years. I don't really know why, but we need to get back on track. We talked a lot about air combat capability gaps in recent years with respect to the JSF and the Super Hornet. We can't either afford a submarine capability.
Who do you blame for those lost few years?
Well, I'll leave it for others to make that assessment. But these are difficult questions because Australia is in a unique position, geographically isolated. We need the subs to be able to go a long distance for a long period of time at certain speeds, and there aren't off-the-shelf choices there. We probably need to design our own sub, and we need to start. Well, we needed to start yesterday, and we better get on with it.
Can I ask you just finally on this issue, Kevin Andrews, defence spending, should it be quarantined, as Joel Fitzgibbon suggests?
Every area of expenditure should be subject to scrutiny. But having said that, defence is one of the most important priorities that any government faces. One of the primary tasks of any national government is the defence of the nation, and so it must be always looked at from that perspective. What I hear Joel saying, more or less, is that somebody's been going slow, and it hasn't been him because it hasn't been in the job for a while, but that raises some serious questions about what is actually happening. If that's the government's projection of where they want to go and it's not being met, well then I think serious questions ought to be asked. But overall, our approach is defence is one of the primary tasks of government. Yes, everything should be open to scrutiny, but it should be against that background.
Right, well, speaking of defence, after the break we're going to look at Afghanistan and the Prime Minister's announcement this week of a renewed timetable to withdraw troops. Stay with us.
Delicious new strawberry fields from Tic Tac. The carnival is glamorous fashion and Group 1 glory.
My chance to take centre stage.
The carnival is an event the whole family can enjoy.
The carnival is when all my hard work pays off.
The carnival is Australia and New Zealand's test match for horse racing.
See Australia's best battle it out under the Queensland sun at the Channel 7 Brisbane Racing Carnival. Book with Blue Holidays for great deals on airfares, accommodation and race day tickets, or visit brc.com.au.
The mid-season sale is now on in-store at Myer. Receive your 9-piece gift when you spend $70 or more on Estee Lauder. Offer ends this Sunday or while stock lasts. Purchased in one transaction excludes gift sets, cannot be used online or with other offers.
Does heartburn stop you eating the things you love? Triggers include spicy food, drinking alcohol, or eating too fast. Gaviscon can help. Unlike some antacids which slowly neutralise stomach acid, Gaviscon works differently by creating a physical barrier to soothe heartburn in just 4 minutes. That's why in a clinical study, 3 out of 4 people enjoyed better relief with Gaviscon versus the antacid tested. Trust Gaviscon, enjoy life and live well.
Open Universities Australia brings over 20 leading universities and partners together online.
Done.
You won't just make do, you will do.
Done.
Enrolments close May 13. Open Universities Australia, leading online learning.
Over 75 years, Slater and Gordon lawyers have won many challenges. They've fought to help sufferers regain their dignity, won compensation, advised businesses on managing risk for reward, won better outcomes for many, helped families find happier resolutions, and they can help you with affordable legal advice in more locations than any other law firm. Call 1800 555 777. Slater and Gordon Lawyers, no challenge too great.
The stunning four-wheel drive Peugeot 4007. With an exceptionally strong turbo diesel engine delivering outstanding fuel efficiency and a versatile interior with up to 7 seats. And right now it's never been more affordable. From just $35,990 drive away. 4007, the premium SUV from Peugeot.
After the final Space Shuttle mission, NASA's path to the stars continues through research and development.
Different from any other mission.
Administrator Charles F. Bolden tells how they are recommitting.
This is the future.
Tuesday on APAC, Australia's Public Affairs channel.
We're joined this week by Chief Government Whip Joel Fitzgibbon, author and columnist Cassandra Wilkinson, Gerard Henderson, the Director of the Sydney Institute, and the Shadow Minister for Families, Housing and Human Services, Kevin Andrews. The Prime Minister this week announced a speedier timeframe for drawing down Australian troops from Afghanistan. It depends on an announcement from President Hamid Karzai, which is due next month, that Uruzgan, the province where Australian troops are based, is going to be handed over to Afghan National Security Control. And then the Prime Minister says it'll be 12 to 18 months, a period at which our troops will start to come home. Means the bulk of them could be home by the end of next year. Joel Fitzgibbon, this hasn't yet been formally discussed, though, with Australia's allies. There's a summit in Chicago next month where that's due to happen. And we did see some concern raised. There was an unnamed senior British military official quoted in the London press saying it was unhelpful and an orderly withdrawal could unravel if nations start announcing different timetables. Why wasn't this discussed first at Chicago before being announced?
Well, the dialogue is constant, David, but the point here is that we went into Afghanistan for one very good reason, that is to make the world a safer place for everyone, but in particular Australians. By any measure, objective measure, we've achieved that objective. Now, again, don't want to overly make a political point, but we inherited a less than ideal situation, that is this government on Afghanistan, but we fought for a seat at the decision-making table. We bolstered our troop numbers, we bolstered our aid effort, we reconfigured our deployment to focus on the training of the Afghan National Army, and all these things now have provided us with an opportunity to bring the troops home sooner than we might have expected. But I made the point earlier in the week that that is not the end of our military contribution. The Afghan security forces will need both NATO assets and special forces clearing and disrupting for them, and of course for training purposes. So we'll be there for a long time to come.
What does a long time to come mean, and particularly special forces, which the Afghan ambassador made clear this week that they're still going to need. Are we going to be there another decade?
Well, I'm sure if Churchill could have predicted the date for the end of the war in 1939, he would have been very happy. No one's in a position to do that. But suffice to say, given the environment there, we'll be around for some time to come.
And what about the financial aspect of this? Because there's going to be a need, isn't there, for countries like Australia to continue contributing financially to Afghanistan?
Well, both on the aid front and training fronts, but also there's got to be a funding sharing arrangement amongst the partners to ensure we can build the Afghan National Army to more than 350,000, I think, initially. It will then wind back. That's very expensive. Funding an ANA of the size of more than 300,000 is about 90% of the Afghan government's budget. So someone has to pay, and the Prime Minister's made it pretty clear that we'll be happy to continue to make a contribution.
And the coalition, given you're in power when we got into this war, you wouldn't quibble with an ongoing financial contribution?
Well, I think the point that Joel's making is that this is a drawdown on our troops there, a reasonably significant drawdown, but there will be an ongoing significant contribution of, I think you said, some 300 or so, possibly, forces, but as I understand
I said there are 300 special forces there now.
But as I understand, it could be some hundreds of Australians in Afghanistan.
I wouldn't expect it to be that large.
Some time, but whatever it is, it's not... any sense that this is a total withdrawal is inaccurate. It's a significant drawdown. And our view about it has been that that should primarily be based on the advice of the military commanders in Afghanistan. And the Prime Minister has said that that's the reason which she has, in a sense, put this offer or this proposal on the table for the meeting in Chicago, at which it will all be discussed by the partners. And our view is, if that is the advice that has been given by the military commanders, well then that's the advice that should be accepted.
So, just to be clear, there's no suggestion that politics is behind this, that the timing of the election late next year has anything to do with this?
Well, there's a very important point to be made here, David. We don't decide when the 4th Brigade of the Afghan National Army is to a standard which allows us to come home. That decision is made very formally by NATO in partnership with the government of Afghanistan. So this is not about politics. What the Prime Minister is saying is that our troops have done such a fine job training the Afghan Brigade that looks like we might be able to come home earlier than was expected.
And all we would say is we would certainly hope that this is not motivated by politics. It's motivated primarily by the advice which the military commanders on the ground have given.
You hope that, but
yes.
Your colleague George Brandis was given a briefing this week from Defence on this, and then took that advice presumably to the Shadow Cabinet. Are you convinced?
Well, we can accept the advice which has been given, and we can accept on face value what the Prime Minister has said, and that's what we're doing. So, as I said, we would hope that that's the situation, because I think in matters military, then they ought to be above day-to-day politics.
Cass, do you think it matters whether we withdraw now or in 18 months or in 2 years?
I think what matters is that, with great respect to both of you, and I appreciate why you have to be cautious in the way that you discuss it, it suits both major parties to get the war off the table as fast as possible. And that means, unfortunately, that we won't discuss this as much as we should. We're in a heartbreaking situation where we know that our troops are responsible for saving lives, and we know that our troops are the reasons that girls can go to school, and we know that our troops are stopping more girls from being killed for getting an education. But it's also the case that we have to ask ourselves as a country, at what point can you ask another citizen to put their life on their line for the defence of our country when there's no direct, clear and present danger to our security anymore? And the difficulty we have is that we're sending our army to do foreign policy and development policy, not actually to do frontline defence in this situation anymore. That's the discussion that we need to have at a policy level in this country, and we're avoiding it.
When we look at whether this whole war has been worthwhile and whether we should still be there for another couple of years, it's a good point that the women of Afghanistan would certainly argue, I'm sure, that there have been great gains in having coalition forces there. I did see during the week, though, a retired Major General Alan Stretton, a former Army leader during the Vietnam War, say he doesn't think the deaths of the 32 Australian soldiers in Afghanistan has been justified.
But Alan Stretton, I think, has opposed every Australian involvement since he was involved himself. I mean, this is not a surprising comment from Alan Stretton.
We forget, though, I mean, and John Howard made this point many times, we didn't go to Afghanistan for the Americans. We went because of Bali, we went because of Timor. People forget, given the time that's passed, that there was a significant threat to Australia, and that's why we went.
But it has been quite a period of time since those Al-Qaeda bases were shut down.
Well, not really, because without the US in Afghanistan, they couldn't have got Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. I mean, they couldn't have got to Osama bin Laden through Pakistan. They got at him through Afghanistan. So that area is still alive. I mean, I can understand the Australian government's position and the Australian opposition's position, but a lot of the strategy, it seems to me, I'm not an expert, has been surprising, because once President Obama announced the United States would be virtually out by 2014, I mean, at that stage, people have only got to wait. If you're Taliban, you've only got to hang around and wait for that to happen. Now, sure, the Americans are going to go, and we can't do much about that, but the lesson of Vietnam was that firstly, the Americans went with promises to support the military in South Vietnam, who fought very bravely for many years, virtually on their own. And then because of Watergate, the Americans cut off all the money and said goodbye. So what's important, I mean, Joel's making the point that and Kevin is making the point, we certainly have to continue the aid and advice and assistance to the Afghan National Army, because on the precedent of Vietnam, that's not necessarily assured if the Americans change their mind, although there is a broader NATO force there.
But we could have, isn't it arguable that we could just be providing that more limited special forces aid, intelligence, financial support, and we could have been doing that over the last couple of years. What do you think, Joel Fitzgibbon?
No, I think it's been incremental, and I don't think 2 years ago we could have been talking about leaving. We're able to do so now. We've rid ourselves of bin Laden. Al-Qaeda's pretty much non-existent in Afghanistan. Most of the, or not, I shouldn't say most, many of the military leaders amongst the Taliban have been captured or killed. It's a changing dynamic. But people make this assumption, well, it's true to a point. If we leave too early, before governance and the rule of law is bedded down, it could turn nasty on us again. But people make the assumption that you can never withdraw. Not true. The pre-2001 situation was one in which the government of the day was prepared to host and give imprimatur to groups like Al-Qaeda. Now, I don't believe we won't end up with a model democracy, of course, but we're not going to end up with a government, and it will be some sort of power-sharing arrangement.
Well, this is the point. I mean, to play devil's advocate, but also to point out the reality, there will still be an insurgency. There will still be a Taliban element there after 2014.
Well, this word Taliban covers so many sins, so many manner of sins. But we'll have a power-sharing arrangement, a government of sorts, and in my view, a power-sharing arrangement which won't have an interest in, again, playing host to, and in fact giving imprimatur to, outsiders like Al-Qaeda. I think that's the big difference that people fail to understand.
Well, yeah, you're right in saying that there's Taliban and then there's Taliban. There's the Haqqani network, which is responsible for a lot of the atrocities that are still going on. But there are some elements, surely, of the Taliban who are willing and want to play a role in the future of Afghanistan.
That's why we can't leave until the security forces of Afghanistan are capable of imposing the rule of law as dictated by the democratically elected government of the day.
Nonetheless, Cass, I would imagine it would send a shiver down the spine of a lot of women in Afghanistan to have any level of Taliban involvement in the government or parliament.
Yes, but the progress of Afghanistan as a nation can't be solved by a few hundred Australian troops. We have trouble recruiting people to our military forces. As a nation, we take our army for granted. We're naive about defence. We don't treat our soldiers well enough. And when we put them in harm's way for policy goals instead of serious defence threats, then we are doing our soldiers a great disrespect. And I just don't think that the threat in Afghanistan any longer justifies asking wives and husbands of soldiers to wait another year or 2 or 3 until they come home.
So you think we should be getting out now?
But it does, Cass, because otherwise 32 Australians have potentially given their lives in vain. We must bed down the security environment we've built.
But that's not going to happen by 2014. It's genuinely not.
No, and I've said, no, it won't happen by 2014. We'll be in a position to bring the mentoring task force home. That is the bulk of our troops, which are basically training the Afghan National Army.
Apply a common standard to the warlords who run those villages, and we will be there forever.
As the Prime Minister has acknowledged, beyond 1314, we will need some special forces there and possibly some other assets making a contribution.
On that logic, are we going to Sudan? Are we sending forces to Sudan? Look, and I'm not trying to have a go at you. What I'm saying is that in avoiding this broader policy discussion about what constitutes a serious defence threat to Australia and what constitutes forward-looking foreign policy, which is where we are now and where we would be when we look at places like Sudan. They're two different things. And you can't ask people to go over there and die for us when you haven't been clear about the agenda.
But I think the other point... Why is that? Because, you know, you're talking about going in somewhere. Well, we made a decision as a nation some years ago that we would go there. Now, as Joel says, the situation is changing and it's gradually changing over time. It's easy to look back and say, retrospectively, oh, maybe we should have done something a little bit earlier, but you've got to make judgments along the way. And my view is that having gone there and having wanted to secure a certain level of government's self-security by the Afghan forces, etc., well, then you've got to be careful to make sure that you're meeting those goals as best you can judge it as you gradually make some changes. Otherwise, if we just walk out, then I think that would be the greatest tragedy of all, to have been there for years, to have lost 32 young Australians and countless more injured, and then to walk out too early and have the whole thing reversed to, you know, a state of anarchy.
None of us are entitled to claim those lives as a justification for our positions, and it's disrespectful.
Gerard, just want to make a point there.
I think the other point is that, as I understand it, I mean, a lot of men and women join the Australian Defence Force because they want overseas engagements. The period when the Defence Force didn't have any attraction was the period when we really didn't do anything after Vietnam. So, I mean, if people join up, they go and do good service. We reward them insofar as we can, and we acknowledge what they've done. And I think our forces in Afghanistan have done extremely well in cooperation with others. But I don't think we can say that I mean, people accept a risk joining the Defence Force. They do it because they want to do it. They go on engagements. We hope they come home.
Nonetheless, governments do have a responsibility for those lives that are lost in wars that they deploy to.
Well, governments are conscious of that, and I mean, you compare the way the Australian government responds these days to one Australian dead soldier to what happened in the First World War, where a lot of this was simply taken for granted. I mean, the British lost thousands on one day. I
want to ask you also about the latest incident that's come to light. Photographs of US soldiers. They're actually 2 years old, the photographs, but they're very disturbing. The soldiers essentially playing with mangled body parts of suicide bombers. It follows the burning of a Quran, other incidents of misconduct. What sort of impact does this have and will this have, Joel Fitzgibbon?
Well, one of our big challenges in Afghanistan, not just Australia, but the international community generally, is holding the support of our local constituencies. And of course, we're losing that battle to an extent. And of course, this doesn't help one bit.
You could argue that this happens in any war zone or in most war zones.
It's typical of counterinsurgencies in particular, where things are very nasty, you know, against both our troops and civilians in the host country. You know, gone are the days as on the beaches of Gallipoli where the Turks and the Aussies had a smoke at half-time. We're living in a very different environment with respect to counterinsurgencies. But you've also got other elements like ubiquitous mobile phone cameras and things which change the dynamic and the media.
And we have it. Well, Joel's point, we have a different media. There was no reporting of the Second World War effectively, and the Allies happened to win it. I think the behaviour of the Los Angeles Times in publishing those photographs is completely reprehensible, reckless. They were asked not to do it by the Obama administration. They did it. It's all very well for editors sitting in Los Angeles to say that they acted according to some moral code, but they're not the people who are going to get their throats cut or get shot up by some guerrilla force. It's going to be either Americans or other allied forces in Afghanistan, or more likely local Afghans are going to get killed.
But isn't the behaviour of troops in the field a legitimate matter of public interest?
Well, it's a matter of concern to a government, but look, no, it's not a matter of public interest if other people are going to get killed. I mean, the outrageous claims by someone on the editorial staff of the LA Times that they can do what they like, but someone else cops it. It's all very well if someone's going to bomb the LA Times building, but they're much more likely to bomb a community centre in Afghanistan. I just think there's a terrible double standard. Look, in the Second World War, this never would have been permitted, and there were bad actions by Australian forces and other forces in the Second World War.
There was also a great deal more censorship of what the media could.
Censorship.
What do you think about the publication of this?
We'd established that My Lai had to be exposed. By the time we got past Vietnam, we knew that covering things up wasn't an option, and it's not healthy for democracy. But that we are holding soldiers to a standard that none of us could reasonably say we could honestly know we can meet ourselves. They're facing horrors we can't imagine. People have killed their friends, their comrades. They react in ways we don't understand, to situations that we don't understand. But I would say quickly that the US doesn't treat their soldiers with the respect that we do. They don't train them well enough. They don't support them well enough. The suicide rate after they've served is astronomical. The Australian soldiers behave better because we invest more time in their professionalisation. That's something we need to maintain here so that we don't wind up with a similar problem.
It's not just professionalisation, though. I think it's a sense of the values which we're seeking to uphold. If we're engaged in a war which is largely, well, partly at least, a war about ideology, about a different approach, about us saying that democracy is a higher form of government which carries with it human rights, then there is some obligation on all of us to try and uphold those human rights. Now, I accept that these sorts of things have probably happened in every war, and that when you've got a 24-hour media, which we have now, and you've got it to the point of having it on mobile phone cameras and all of that, then there's more likelihood that things are going to be revealed than they were in previous wars. But having said that, and I think this is part of the sense that Australian military forces have, that we are seeking to uphold a way of life, a system of government, etc., in the broader sense. I don't mean in a partisan sense, and therefore there is certain responsibilities that flow through to the ordinary soldier as a result of that. Now, that's partly, of course, of the training, but I think it's the sense of values that we take into it. And if we are engaged in some sort of global war against those who don't believe in democracy, well, then we have to try and uphold democracy.
Yeah, but if the Obama administration asks you not to do something because of they're concerned about a reaction to Afghans and allied forces in Afghanistan, I would think a responsible media would say, well, we'll hold off for a year. I mean, these photographs are 2 years old. The American forces will be primarily out in 2 years' time. Hold off for 2 years. But they didn't do that. I think it's completely
That's a different issue, Jared, and I tend to agree with you on that.
Well, we're going to return to domestic politics after the break and look at why Labor is still struggling and what it can do about it.
I've started your family. I'm enjoying your retirement.
I'm discovering yourself.
I just bought your dream boat.
Shh, I'm on your safari. Got your facelift?
Proposed to your girlfriend. Convertible.
Every year, $4 billion worth of Australian dreams are being stolen by the major banks and their low-interest savings accounts. Steal them back with a high-interest savings account from Rabo Direct.
The VB Razor Glass Appeal is one of the single biggest public contributions to veterans' welfare in Australia. This year, VB once again will donate $1 million to the RSL and Legacy. I'll be raising a glass to the men and women in the Middle East. Who will you raise a glass to?
Introducing Australia's first Samsung 4G smartphone, exclusive to Telstra. Now send, stream and surf at speeds that'll blow you away. The Samsung Galaxy S2 4G on Australia's fastest national mobile network. Get it for $5 a month on the Telstra $59 Freedom Connect plan. For more, visit a Telstra store or telstra.com/Samsung 4G. Things happen faster on 4G.
At Sage, we have over 6 million customers, And that makes us the leading global supplier of business management solutions for companies with up to 1,000 employees. Our integrated ERP and CRM solutions power mid-sized and larger businesses, including manufacturing, distribution, construction and services. And our cloud-enabled solutions grow with your business. With credentials like these, we must be doing something right. So call us on 13 Sage.
Right now, your Nissan dealer has mega deals on micro demos, so you can get in sync with your city for a whole lot less. See your Nissan dealer for mega deals on a micro demo today.
We started playing cricket, and I hit the ball so high that Uncle Mark, he forgot where he was going. He tried to catch the ball and landed face first in the mud. It was so funny, Dad. You should have been there.
Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
Anzac Day. For the first time ever, see it as it should be. Live in high definition, with no ad breaks. King lives! Only on Fox Footy.
You're watching The Nation. We're joined this week by Chief Government Whip Joel Fitzgibbon, Cassandra Wilkinson, columnist, author, and a hopeful Labor candidate for the job of Sydney Lord Mayor. Gerard Henderson is the director of the Sydney Institute, also a columnist with the Sydney Morning Herald. And Kevin Andrews, the Shadow Minister for Families, Housing and Human Services. I want to look at the big picture political question at the moment. Why is Labor still struggling? There were hopes that once the leadership tension had gone away, and that has gone away since the contest between Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard earlier in the year, that things would improve. Well, they haven't. Now the hope is that once the carbon tax is bedded down and people get their tax cuts, things will improve. But we're just seeing no real lift. And from my understanding, there is some great concern starting to build in Labor ranks about this and discussion about what to do about it, what sort of peace offering even can be made with the electorate to try and turn things around. Cass, what do you reckon? Is there anything Julia Gillard can do to turn around her fortunes at the moment?
I guess the future of the federal government is probably sealed at this time, but
it's all over.
The future for Labor is a bigger problem, and the answers to that are quite different, I think. The key problem facing Labor at the moment is that during the 80s and 90s, when I joined the Labor Party, it was the party of growth. It was a party that believed in lifting the barriers to opportunity as a country and as individuals. It was a party of liberalisation with a positive social agenda, creative patriotism, but essentially...
So it needs to protect that brand now, even if the next election's lost.
Is that the socialists have taken over again, and we've become a big party of big government.
Joel Fitzgibbon, have the socialists taken over?
Well, I certainly agree it's been a progressive government. And it's been a reformist government, and that's why it's struggling. And reform is difficult. Ask John Howard with the GST. But the GST is a good analogy because, Labor warned that when the GST came in, the sky was going to fall. When it only fell by about 1/4, people breathed a sigh of relief, and the world moved on. I think the same will be true of the carbon price. The same will be true of the mining tax, which has now proven to be quite a popular
So you don't
policy.
think the next election's lost?
No, I'm not allowed to think the next election's lost, David. I can never allow myself to believe that, but it's going to be tough.
But you really think that once these taxes are in and some of the goodies around them start to flow, things will improve?
And the vacuum for Tony Abbott will become enormous. He won't have the scare campaign to run. He'll be forced to start answering questions about what he's going to do. And again, Kevin, without being unduly political about it, he's going to struggle because he doesn't stand for much.
But Gerard, I guess...
Can I say quickly interrupt? Tony Abbott does stand for something. He also stands for socialism. The problem that the Liberal Party faces right now is exactly the problem the Labor Party faces right now, which is that both parties are trying to have too big an agenda, deciding that government will do too much, and as Margaret Thatcher said, the problem with socialism is eventually you run out of other people's money.
Gerard, just getting back though to whether the carbon tax, and once it's in, things are going to get any better for Labor, isn't the reality that, rightly or not, every electricity price rise, factory closure, will be blamed on the carbon tax?
Well, Labor had two problems. one analysis pointed out to me, when Joel Fitzgibbon left the cabinet, Labor started to fall down. Julia Gillard got through the election narrowly with the minority government. If you look at early 2010, Julia Gillard was doing okay as against Tony Abbott, and then she broke the carbon tax promise. And from the time she broke the carbon tax promise, there's been this big gap has opened up and it hasn't closed. And what now happens is that every time there's an increase in an electricity bill or a petrol price, people think carbon tax, and I don't know how a government can turn that around. But without the carbon tax broken promise, I think we'd be in quite a different ball game. But the promise was broken, and that having been broken, and you've only got to look at the polls, they're as clear as anything. This big gap opens up around May of that year, and it's just kept the same way for about 12 months.
And it seems pretty clear Labor underestimated the impact that
Labor underestimated the impact, particularly in Queensland and New South Wales. I think Labor's position is better in Victoria, but Labor underestimated. And they also completely underestimated Tony Abbott. So did many journalists. Tony Abbott is a very effective politician, a very effective opposition leader, and he has one of the best records of achievement of any opposition leader in Australian history so far.
Kevin Andrews is hardly going to disagree with that, I'm sure. But let me ask you, does Tony Abbott need to change anything? Can he maintain the way he's been going over the last 18 months?
Well, I think the dynamic at the moment is, as Gerard has indicated, that the Australian public simply distrust the Prime Minister. And they do largely because of a broken promise, and it's not the only one. There's the promise to Andrew Wilkie about poker machines, and there are others. And I think they see the Prime Minister now as somebody who just spins everything, so they're always sceptical about what she says, and they frankly distrust her. Now, that doesn't mean the next election's over, and we're not certainly taking the next election for granted. But there's, potentially 18 months to go to the next election. You talk about us having policies. Well, we've got 2 budgets to go before the next election. We don't even know what the state of the finances is. So we will continue to do what we're doing, but gradually over time we will put policies out there. So Tony's making some, what used to be called headland speeches, major speeches on issues from time to time. We will continue to do that so that people have a sense of the direction we want to take. And I disagree with Cass that it's a socialist direction, anything but...
Socialising dental care. You want to socialise disability insurance. You're promising more spending for more families and more interest groups.
No, you can't call that socialist. I mean, disability insurance, let's take that, which there is bipartisan support about. There's 400,000 people who are profoundly disabled. If their disability came about because they were in a motor vehicle accident, we would have transport accident commissions or the equivalent in the States looking after those people in a way which is appropriate. But if you're born through a head injury at birth or some other accident which is not involving a motor vehicle, then you are often in a very difficult situation. And I know this from personal experience within my broader family. And what happens when someone like that, who gets to the age of 45 or 50, who is reasonably profoundly disabled, and their older parents who at the ages of 70 or 80 say, how can I provide for this child of mine in the future? I think that is a scandal that we as a country can't do that. And that's why we've been quite strong.
The fact is that's one of the only ones where that's the case.
That's why we've been quite strong about that issue, about why we're supporting the government. And we're still asking where the money's coming from. I think that's a legitimate question. But that's not socialism. That's just dealing with something that the private sector is not going to deal with that, hasn't dealt with that, and we should, as a civilised country, deal with those sorts of issues.
Yeah, Cass, it's pretty hard to argue that this isn't a glaring
disability
example.
Insurance is the one example in their bucket at the moment where there is a need for direct government funding. I give it the case in dental health. The reason that we have a dental health crisis is because the government rules prevent more HECS funded. It's 50 places a year for HECS funding for people to study dentistry. What we have is a regulatory failure in dental care, but what we're hearing from the Liberals is that we need Medicare for dentistry, on top of which outrageously oversubscribed maternity leave schemes, industry subsidies.
But on Dentacare, why should the taxpayer through Medicare fund problems with every other part of your body but not your teeth?
Because the taxpayers shouldn't be paying for as much as they're currently paying for in Medicare. I mean, you said earlier that private hospitals take pressure off the public system. They don't, because we get billed equally by private sector doctors within both systems.
Right, we're getting a little bit away from the politics.
Can I just say, Kevin said they're not taking anything for granted, but I heard Christopher Pyne very recently speculating as to whether they'll control the Senate. Axiomatically, it flows that they're making some assumptions about their majority in the lower house. But you asked me about our prospects. The other thing I didn't get a chance to say is that, as demonstrated by Joe Hockey's mischievous speech in London last night, there are enormous divides on Kevin's side of politics. There's a lot of restlessness in that show. I think that's going to start to manifest itself.
I just want to ask, is there anything, this is what I'm trying to get to, is there anything Labor can do, Julia Gillard can do, as a sort of peace offering, as a sort of, I hear you, to the electorate, as John Howard did on a few issues when he was in trouble? Can she do anything? Can she change the price of the carbon tax? Is there anything that would make a difference?
Well, I think the decision of the Labor government to dump the emissions trading scheme before the last election is probably why they got home. Narrowly got home, sort of got home, to form minority government. And anything substantial would have to be a substantial rewriting or change to the carbon tax. Now, that's a big cause, not impossible.
I disagree. The two things that are causing the most pressure on Australian incomes at the moment are transport and housing, and the federal government has plenty of latitude to deal with putting more resources into putting downward pressure on housing and infrastructure costs in major cities. If they took that seriously, they could make a significant difference.
Tonight there are people at home who are not turning on the electricity. I mean, I know some of them who are worried about power costs.
Failing to deregulate the power industry. It has nothing to do with the carbon tax.
We're nearly out of time, but just finally, Joel, is there anything that you think the government can do as a peace offering?
Well, to use an old John Howard phrase, she has to stay the course. She's demonstrated that she's a hard-nosed reformer. It's caused her a bit of grief and pain along the way.
And use that
if she was to reverse that now, that would be counterproductive. She's got to see these policies through.
All right, we will have to wrap it up there, I'm afraid. But Joel Fitzgibbon, Cass Wilkinson, Gerard Henderson, Kevin Andrews, thank you all for joining us this week. We'll be back same time next week. Hope you can join us then. For now, I'm David Spears. Thanks for your company.